Iraq War of 2003 was a major event internationally, very important in British politics, and still has many repercussions. Personally, I'm involved in the official British inquiry, and because we haven't reported yet, I'm sure you'll understand that I'm not going to be able to say too much myself about my own thoughts and conclusions about the origins of the war and the way it was conducted, but I'm very pleased that a number of my colleagues are going to be able to explain to you the relevance of their research, how it was conducted, and its implications for thinking about not only Iraq, but of conflict more generally.
The honest answer is we don't really know why, but we have various accounts from the diaries and memoirs of people, and we have the suspicions and analysis of various commentators. I think it's important not to forget that this was the period straight after 9/11, and as a factor driving thinking in Washington, the attacks against the United States changed the way they thought about instability, especially in the Middle East and the Arab world. This was essential in how they approached a problem that had been ongoing for many administrations. The problem of Saddam not only had been faced by George Bush's father, but also by subsequent presidents, and it was unfinished business not just for America, but for the world. The United Kingdom stated that it would stand shoulder to shoulder with America in the struggle against terrorism, and fairly quickly this started to be widened to include states of concern, rogue states as they had previously been called, and states that possessed or had the potential to develop weapons of mass destruction. So the two things started to merge into one threat of disorder, again, in this region of the world that all of us have to care about because of the global economy and its dependence on oil. And all these things came together, plus a traditional British close alliance with America and the British requirement to keep the intelligence relationship as close as possible in this period, as it started to emerge that the al-Qaeda threat was not just against America, but also very much against the United Kingdom.
I think that it's rather disappointing that the general public now, when asked about the impact of Iraq on the health of the UK armed forces, they reply that 94% of them believe that it has been overwhelmingly negative. In fact, the evidence doesn't support that at all. In fact, it's almost the other way around. For the majority of people, serving has not left them with long-term physical or mental health problems. Now, obviously, we concentrate on the smaller numbers that it has, but I'm slightly worried that we're already developing an almost Vietnam-like narrative that everyone who comes back from Iraq is depressed, drug-addicted, demoralized, dangerous, in prison, and so on and so forth. And the statistics suggest that this isn't the case.
In this debate about the war in Iraq, we've lost sight of the fact that life for the ordinary Iraqi today is better than it was under Saddam Hussein. And given what's happening in the region, had Iraqis risen up against Saddam in the way that people in other countries had, it would have made even the conflict in Syria look tame and mild. We are better off today living in a world without Saddam Hussein, and we shouldn't be ashamed to say that. Of course, there are sectarian tensions still within Iraq. The civil infrastructure is devastated after the war. But these things are slowly resolving themselves as all countries go through these changes and upheavals. It takes a while for them to settle down. But Iraq has the opportunity to do that, which many of its neighbors don't at this moment in time. And I would use the example, for example, of the Korean War. When that ended in 1953, if we'd been looking around at that stage, we would have said it was a disaster. And now look at South Korea. It's one of the most stable and prosperous countries in the region, if not the world. So Iraq has the chance to develop. I'm not saying it will go down those lines, but it has the opportunity. And I think that's all you can really do for a country.
We're trying to really bring attention to the longer-term effects of war conditions and how that changes a society's sense of well-being. Because you have the issue of displaced individuals and families, you have secondary displacements, you have orphan children, you have normalized violence, particularly when it comes to children growing up in war conditions. And perhaps most significant would be the longer-term psychological effects of wars and the kind of damages that really outlive wars themselves, because in a sense wars never end and their traumas and their burden is carried through generations. And that's the kind of damage that should really concern us all.
The one thing I think is particularly striking about the Iraq war from 2003 and then later on is the question of access, and this is what you see reflected in the coverage. Access is particularly interesting in the initial phase. You have the idea of embedding on a massive scale something that hasn't really been done to that extent before, where journalists were allowed to travel with the troops and to observe them during the military operation. But there's a counter-narrative developing because of the importance and the rise to importance of Al Jazeera. At this stage, there was no Al Jazeera English, but still they had different kind of access to the people on the ground. They had an advantage because they were more familiar with the locality, with the region, with the language. And they reported really the civilian suffering much more than Western outlets would have done at this point in time.
The worry is that the media portrayal, which is universally negative, to be honest, and is always about severe long-term mental health problems, is not accurate. There are some, certainly. I mean, the rate of post-traumatic stress disorder, the very classic psychiatric disorder of war, runs at about 3 to 4%. Now, that's large numbers when you think about it year on, year out. Nevertheless, it's not 90%. And similarly, the rate of severe physical injuries, the very, very visible, of course, but it's still not a huge number, and, one that we need to monitor and look after in the future. But I think there's a danger that we might create a very negative narrative of the conflict and the impact on our armed forces. And I'm talking about the health impact, of course, if we're not careful. And indeed, on the anniversary itself, on the 10th anniversary, we have a big paper coming in The Lancet that's looking at violence and criminal behaviour and showing that actually, again, one impact of deployment has been an increase in the rate of criminal convictions, mainly for violence and sexual offending in those who served. Now, that's complicated because the military is not a random section of society and they do recruit from people from disadvantaged backgrounds. But even when you take account of the background, particularly the Army and Navy recruit from, you still see an increase in violent offending in those who've come back. So again, you see a social impact there of the war, not much talked about, but probably of some significance.
I think when we look at the issue of radicalisation within the UK as a result of the Iraq War, we need to consider two important aspects. On the one hand, of course, there were lots of people who were very angry and very upset about what transpired in Iraq. But the other hand, we need to consider that something like 7/7, for example, the idea that this was blowback or that these were Blair's bombs, as they were called, is entirely incorrect. The people involved in that plot, for example, had been monitored by the security service even before September the 11th for ties to radical Islam. And that network to which they belonged and to which many other jihadists belonged as well had existed throughout the 1990s in this country and really came into its own during that time.
In the round, I would describe the campaign as operationally successful and strategically a failure, because the disorder that followed presented the world, but especially American allies, with an insurgency that they had not wanted and certainly hadn't prepared for. I think the question of stability in Iraq is now going to be much more a regional question, and is going to be about the big players, the big powers there, which of course is Iran. Economically, we're being told that one of the victors of the last period has been Turkey, surprisingly, as has been discussed in some of the specialist press. But overall, the hope must be that a democratic, even if not completely stable, Iraq is an important step towards the region becoming less volatile. Now, that's not going to change that quickly. Iran is a very particular and powerful neighbour with great influence in Iraq. But the more interesting question is whether Iraq and the invasion of Iraq has been the catalyst of what we now call the Arab Spring, or whatever you want to call it, a catalyst for change in the Arab world. This was not a stable leader in a stable part of the world. I think history, maybe a bit more than 10 years, 20 years from now, will have to answer that question, whether this was the start of a positive democratizing trend in the Middle East, or essentially a foreign adventure that was much more costly than everybody who planned it expected.
I think Iraq going forward and into the future has something that none of its regional neighbours have at this moment in time, and that is hope. If you look at Syria and the disaster that's taking place there, or the upheavals in Egypt, in Libya, or even in countries like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, where these repressive regimes are very much in place and nothing's going to challenge them. What the Iraqis have now is a real opportunity to build a civil democratic future that none of their neighbours have, and that gives them hope, and that's very important.